Sarah Martinez wiped the blood from her split lip as she sat alone on the gymnasium floor. The other kids had already left for lunch, their laughter still echoing in her ears. At 12 years old, she was used to being the target, but today had been particularly brutal. "Don't cry, princess," Jake Morrison had sneered as he knocked her books from her hands for the third time that week. "Maybe if you weren't such a weakling, people might actually like you." The nickname Princess wasn't meant as a compliment. Sarah was small for her age, barely 5 feet tall, with delicate features that made her look even younger. Her classmates saw weakness where she felt strength building. They saw a victim where she was becoming a survivor. Sarah's father, Roberto Martinez, had died in Afghanistan when she was 8. He'd been a Marine, and Sarah kept his service photo on her nightstand. Every night she'd tell him about her day, about the bullies, about how much she missed him. Her mother, Linda, worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep their small apartment. Sarah learned early that she had to fight her own battles. The bullying had started in elementary school, but middle school made everything worse. Kids were crueler now, more organized in their torment. There was something about Sarah that seemed to trigger their worst instincts. Maybe it was her quiet confidence, or the way she never really broke down no matter what they did to her. She'd take their hits, their insults, their pranks, and just keep moving forward. "You're too soft for this world," her gym teacher, Mr. Patterson, had told her just that morning when she couldn't complete the rope climb. Some people just aren't built for physical challenges. But Sarah remembered something different. She remembered her father's stories about basic training, about how the drill sergeants would break you down just to build you back up stronger. She remembered him saying that the strongest people weren't the ones who never fell. They were the ones who got back up every single time. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to an empty apartment, she walked to the public library and checked out every book she could find about the military. She read about Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon. She learned about women who had broken barriers, who had proven that size and gender didn't determine strength. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, noticed Sarah's intense focus on these books. "Planning to join the military, honey?" she asked kindly. "Maybe," Sarah said quietly. "My dad was a Marine." Mrs. Chen nodded understandingly. "You know, there are some programs for military families, physical fitness programs, mentorship opportunities. Would you like me to help you look into them?" That's how Sarah found herself at the local Veterans Center the following Saturday. The building was old and worn, but it felt like sacred ground to her. Inside, she met Carlos Vega, a former Navy SEAL who ran fitness programs for kids from military families. Carlos was intimidating at first glance, built like a tank, with scars on his arms and a no-nonsense attitude. But when he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, he saw something that others missed. "You Roberto Martinez's daughter?" he asked after she'd introduced herself. Sarah nodded, surprised. "You knew my dad?" "Served with him in Iraq before he went to Afghanistan. Good man. Tough as nails." Carlos studied her for a moment. "You got his eyes, determined eyes." That day, Carlos put Sarah through a basic fitness assessment. She was weak by conventional standards, couldn't do a single pull-up, struggled with push-ups, had no muscle mass to speak of. But Carlos wasn't looking at her current abilities. He was looking at her attitude. When other kids would have quit or complained, Sarah just kept trying. When she failed at something, she'd ask how to do it better. When she got winded, she'd catch her breath and go again. There was something unbreakable in her spirit. "Tell me why you're here," Carlos said after the assessment. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "They call me Princess," she said finally. "At school. They think I'm weak." "Are you?" The question hung in the air. Sarah thought about all the times she'd wanted to quit, to disappear, to just accept that she wasn't built for this world. Then she thought about her father's photo, about the pride in his eyes when he talked about serving his country. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not weak. I'm just not strong yet." Carlos smiled for the first time since she'd met him. "That's the right answer, kid. That's exactly the right answer." From that day forward, Sarah's life took on a new structure. She'd go to school, endure whatever cruelty her classmates dealt out, then head straight to the Veterans Center. Carlos started her on a program that was part physical training, part mental conditioning, and part education about military life. The physical training was brutal. Carlos didn't believe in going easy on anyone, regardless of age or size. Sarah started with basic bodyweight exercises, modified push-ups, assisted pull-ups, wall sits that left her legs shaking. Everything hurt. Every day she went home with new aches and pains. But slowly something began to change. The girl who couldn't climb a rope at school was learning to do pull-ups at the center. The weakling who got pushed around was developing real muscle, real strength. More importantly, she was developing the mindset of a warrior. Carlos taught her about mental toughness, about pushing through when every fiber of your being wanted to quit. He told her stories about SEAL training, about Hell Week, about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things simply because they refused to give up. "The water doesn't care if you're tired," he'd tell her during swimming sessions at the local pool. "The ocean doesn't care if you're scared. Your enemies won't care if you're having a bad day. You have to be stronger than your circumstances." At school, the bullying continued, but something was different now. Sarah was different. When Jake Morrison shoved her in the hallway, she didn't stumble like she used to. When kids made fun of her size, she didn't shrink into herself. She was still the same small girl, but there was something new in her posture, something that made the smarter bullies think twice. The change didn't go unnoticed. Her grades improved because she could concentrate better. Her confidence grew, not just physically, but in every aspect of her life. She started speaking up in class, volunteering for presentations, taking on challenges she would have avoided before. Her mother noticed the transformation, too. "You seem different lately," Linda said one evening as they shared a rare dinner together. "Stronger somehow." Sarah told her about the Veterans Center, about Carlos, about her training. Linda was worried at first. Her daughter was only 13, still just a child. But she could see the positive changes, could see that Sarah was happier, more confident, more herself than she'd ever been. "Your father would be proud," Linda said quietly. "He always said you had warrior blood in you." By the end of 8th grade, Sarah had completely transformed. She wasn't just physically stronger. Though she could now do 20 pull-ups and run a 6-minute mile, she was mentally tougher than anyone her age had a right to be. She'd learned to channel her anger and frustration into fuel for improvement rather than letting it consume her. The bullying hadn't stopped entirely, but it had changed character. Kids who used to pick on her now gave her a wider berth. There was something in her eyes that warned them off, something that suggested she wasn't the easy target she used to be. Jake Morrison found this out the hard way during the last week of school. He cornered Sarah by her locker, probably planning one final humiliation before summer break. "Still think you're tough, princess?" he sneered, reaching out to knock her books down again. But this time, Sarah was ready. In one fluid motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisted it just enough to make him uncomfortable, and looked him straight in the eye. "My name is Sarah," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made several nearby students stop and stare. "And if you touch me again, you'll find out just how tough I really am." Jake tried to pull his hand away, but Sarah's grip was like iron. For the first time in years, he was the one who looked scared. "Let go," he said, his voice not quite as confident as usual. Sarah held his gaze for another moment, then released his wrist. "Have a good summer, Jake." She walked away, leaving him standing there, confused and unsettled. Word spread quickly through the school about the confrontation. For the first time in her academic career, Sarah finished the year with respect rather than ridicule. That summer, Carlos introduced her to other aspects of military training. She learned basic self-defense, studied military history, and began to understand the complexities of special operations. She learned about the Navy SEALs in detail, their history, their training, their mission. "You ever think about actually doing this for real?" Carlos asked one day as they finished a particularly intense training session. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and considered the question. The bullying, the training, the gradual transformation she'd undergone. It was all leading somewhere. She could feel it building inside her, this sense of purpose that went beyond just getting stronger or proving herself to her classmates. "Yeah," she said finally. "I think about it every day." High school brought new challenges and new opportunities. Sarah had grown some over the summer. She was now 5'3" and had filled out with real muscle mass. She tried out for the cross-country team and made varsity as a freshman. She joined the wrestling team as the only girl and earned respect by working twice as hard as anyone else. But more importantly, she'd found her direction. Every training session with Carlos, every book she read, every conversation with veterans at the center pointed toward the same goal. She was going to become a Navy SEAL. People told her it was impossible. Guidance counselors suggested more realistic career paths. Even some of the veterans thought she was setting herself up for disappointment. Women weren't allowed in combat roles, they reminded her. The SEALs were an all-male unit and likely to stay that way. But Sarah had learned something important during her years of training. Other people's limitations didn't have to become her limitations. The same people who said she was too small, too weak, too feminine to be a warrior had been wrong about her before. They'd be wrong about this too. She started researching everything about women in the military, about the gradual changes in policy, about the lawsuits and political pressure to open more roles to female service members. Change was coming. She could feel it. She just had to be ready when it arrived. Her junior year, everything began to crystallize. The military was slowly opening more positions to women. There was talk of integrating special operations units. Sarah increased her training intensity, pushing herself harder than ever before. Carlos had connected her with other military professionals, former Army Rangers, Marine Force recon operators, Air Force pararescue specialists. Each one taught her something different. But they all had the same message. If you want to be exceptional, you have to do exceptional things. Sarah's high school classmates had long since stopped seeing her as the weak little girl she'd once been. She was now the captain of 3 different sports teams, had earned a black belt in martial arts, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time to help her mother with expenses. The transformation was so complete that when Jake Morrison tried to reconnect with her at a school dance junior year, apparently having forgotten their earlier confrontation, she barely recognized the person she used to be. "Hey, Sarah," he said, approaching her with the kind of confident swagger that used to intimidate her. "Want to dance?" Sarah looked at him for a moment, this person who had tormented her for years, who had called her princess like it was a curse word. She thought about the scared 13-year-old girl who used to flinch at his approach, and she almost smiled. "No, thank you, Jake," she said politely but firmly. "I'm not really interested." He persisted, as bullies often do when their usual tactics don't work. "Come on, don't be like that. We're older now. I've changed." Sarah studied his face, seeing the same entitled attitude that had made her childhood miserable. "Maybe you have," she said, "but I definitely have." She walked away, leaving him standing alone on the dance floor. It wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was simply a young woman who knew her worth choosing not to waste her time on someone who had never appreciated it. By senior year, Sarah's plans were set. She'd been accepted to multiple colleges, but she'd also been in contact with Navy recruiters. The military was changing rapidly, and opportunities that hadn't existed when she started high school were becoming reality. Her mother was proud, but worried. "It's dangerous, Mija," Linda said as they discussed Sarah's future. "I already lost your father to the military." "Dad didn't die because he was weak, Mom," Sarah replied. "He died because he was brave enough to serve something bigger than himself. That's what I want to do too." Linda looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw a young woman who had transformed herself through sheer force of will. The scared little girl was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet confidence and unshakable determination. "He would be proud of you," Linda said finally. "So proud." Graduation day arrived with all the typical pomp and ceremony. Sarah walked across the stage to receive her diploma, but her mind was already focused on what came next. In 2 months, she'd ship out for basic training. From there, she'd begin the long journey toward her ultimate goal. As she sat in her cap and gown, listening to speeches about the future and following dreams, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had started with humiliation and pain, with being called princess by people who saw weakness where she was building strength. Now, as she prepared to enter one of the world's most elite military units, she realized that those early struggles had been necessary. They'd forged her into someone who could handle anything the military threw at her. They'd taught her that other people's opinions didn't define her limits. Carlos was in the audience that day, wearing his dress blues and looking prouder than any father. After the ceremony, he found her among the celebrating families. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked. Sarah looked around at her classmates, at the families taking pictures, at the normal life she was about to leave behind. Then she thought about her father's photo, about the promise she'd made to herself in that gymnasium 6 years ago, about the person she'd become through years of refusing to accept other people's definition of her limitations. "Yeah," she said with absolute certainty. "I'm ready." The girl they'd called Princess was about to become something no one had thought possible, and this was just the beginning. The bus pulled away from the recruitment center at 4:47 a.m., carrying Sarah and 37 other recruits toward Naval Station Great Lakes. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching her hometown disappear into the darkness. In her pocket, she carried her father's dog tags, the only personal item recruits were allowed to keep. Boot camp hit like a tsunami. Within hours of arrival, Sarah found herself standing at attention, while drill instructor Petty Officer Rodriguez screamed instructions that seemed designed more to confuse than inform. The small girl who had once been intimidated by middle school bullies now faced trained military professionals whose job was to break down every recruit and rebuild them as sailors. "What do we have here?" Rodriguez stopped in front of Sarah, his voice dripping with disdain. "Looks like someone's little sister got lost and ended up in my Navy." Sarah stared straight ahead, her voice clear and strong. "Seaman Recruit Martinez reporting for duty, Petty Officer." Rodriguez leaned in closer. "Did someone tell you this was summer camp, Martinez? Because I'm looking at about 90 pounds of nothing that thinks she can hack it with real sailors." The other recruits tried not to smirk. Sarah had heard it all before. Different words, same message. She was too small, too weak, too female. But 8 weeks later, when graduation day arrived, Seaman Martinez was standing with the honor guard, recognized as one of the top graduates in her class. Boot camp had been challenging, but it wasn't a surprise. Sarah's years of training with Carlos had prepared her for the physical demands and mental pressure. What surprised her was how naturally military life suited her. The structure, the discipline, the sense of purpose. It felt like coming home. Her first assignment was aboard the USS Montgomery, a literal combat ship operating in the Pacific. Sarah threw herself into every aspect of her duties, from maintenance work to communications. Her fellow sailors initially viewed her with skepticism, but her competence and work ethic quickly earned their respect. It was during her second deployment that Sarah learned about the policy changes she'd been waiting for. Combat exclusion policies were being lifted. Special operations units were preparing to integrate women. The door she'd been preparing to walk through for years was finally opening. Chief Petty Officer Williams found her working late in the communications center one night. "Martinez, you got a minute?" Sarah secured her equipment and followed him to the deck. Williams was a 20-year veteran who'd served with multiple SEAL teams as support personnel. He'd been watching Sarah's progress with interest. "I hear you've been asking questions about special operations," Williams said, leaning against the rail. "Yes, Chief. I'd like to screen for the SEALs when the program opens to women." Williams studied her in the moonlight. At 19, Sarah had filled out to 5'5" and 135 pounds of lean muscle. Her reputation on the ship was solid. She outworked most of the men, never complained, and had demonstrated leadership potential that impressed the senior enlisted staff. "You know what you're asking for?" Williams asked. "SEAL training isn't like anything you've experienced. Hell Week alone breaks 60% of the men who attempt it, and that's just the beginning." Sarah had read everything she could about SEAL training. She knew about the physical demands, the mental pressure, the infamous Hell Week where candidates were pushed to their absolute limits for 5.5 days on minimal sleep and constant physical stress. "I've been preparing for this since I was 13, Chief." Williams nodded slowly. "I believe you have. But preparation and execution are different animals. Tell you what, we're doing a joint exercise with some SEAL teams next month. I'll arrange for you to train with them informally. See how you measure up." The opportunity came 3 weeks later when they pulled into port in San Diego. Williams introduced Sarah to Senior Chief Marcus Thompson, a SEAL instructor who was curious enough about the coming integration to work with promising candidates. Thompson put Sarah through a condensed version of SEAL screening tests: ocean swims in heavy seas, obstacle courses that pushed her gymnastic abilities to their limits, and mental exercises designed to test her ability to function under extreme stress. "Not bad," Thompson admitted after Sarah completed a particularly brutal session. "Your times aren't spectacular, but they're competitive. More importantly, you don't quit when things get uncomfortable." Over the following months, Sarah continued her regular Navy duties while pursuing additional training opportunities. She attended every advanced school the Navy offered, from dive operations to advanced combat skills. She studied military strategy and foreign languages. Most importantly, she maintained the physical and mental conditioning that would be essential for special operations. The announcement came in early 2016. The Navy SEALs would begin accepting female candidates. Sarah submitted her application package immediately, supported by recommendations from every officer she'd served under. The competition was fierce. Hundreds of female sailors applied for the first screening classes. Sarah was selected for the second integrated class. As she prepared to report to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, she realized that everything in her life had been leading to this moment. Basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, known as BIAD-S, began with indoctrination phase. Sarah found herself one of 3 women in a class of 48 candidates. The instructors made it clear that they expected the integration experiment to fail spectacularly. Instructor Chief Hartley gathered the class for their first briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your worst nightmare. Statistically, about 15% of you will complete this training. For our female candidates, the odds are even worse. No woman has ever earned the SEAL trident. Most people think none ever will." Sarah listened impassively. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire life. "This training will push you beyond anything you thought was possible," Hartley continued. "We will break you down physically, mentally, and emotionally. Some of you will quit today. Most of you will quit before Hell Week. The few who make it through will be fundamentally changed." The first phase focused on physical conditioning and water skills. Sarah's years of preparation showed immediately. While other candidates struggled with the ocean swims and obstacle courses, she moved through the challenges with quiet competence. The pool exercises were particularly revealing. Candidates had to demonstrate comfort in the water, while instructor safety swimmers tried to drown them, a controlled exercise designed to test panic response and water confidence. Several strong candidates rang the bell and quit during these sessions. When Sarah's turn came, the instructors were particularly aggressive. They held her underwater longer, tangled her equipment more thoroughly, and created more chaotic scenarios than they used with the male candidates. Sarah endured it all with the same calm focus she'd developed during years of bullying. "Interesting," Hartley noted as Sarah surfaced for the final time. "Martinez doesn't panic." Week 3 brought the first major attrition. Of the original 48 candidates, only 31 remained. One of the female candidates had quit during the second week, overwhelmed by the constant physical demands and psychological pressure. Sarah's reputation among her classmates was evolving. Initially, some had resented her presence, viewing the integration as a politically motivated social experiment. But her performance was undeniable. She consistently finished in the top third of physical evolutions, helped struggling teammates without being asked, and maintained a positive attitude even during the worst training scenarios. Candidate Johnson, a former college football player from Texas, summed up the changing attitude during a rare break between evolutions. "I thought you girls would slow us down," he admitted to Sarah. "But you're carrying your weight, and then some." The obstacle course became Sarah's signature evolution. Her gymnastics background and years of specific training gave her advantages that pure size and strength couldn't match. She'd fly through obstacles that left bigger candidates struggling, finishing consistently in the top 5 times. But it was her performance during surf torture that really caught the instructor's attention. Candidates had to lie in the freezing Pacific surf, arms linked, while waves crashed over them for hours. The exercise was designed to induce hypothermia and test mental resilience. While other candidates shivered uncontrollably and begged for relief, Sarah seemed to enter a meditative state. She'd learned years earlier how to separate her mind from physical discomfort, a skill that proved invaluable during the worst training evolutions. "Martinez!" Hartley called after one particularly brutal surf session. "How are you not hypothermic?" Sarah's lips were blue and she was shivering, but her voice was steady. "Mind over matter, Instructor Hartley." The approach to Hell Week brought increased pressure and attrition. Only 26 candidates remained, including Sarah and one other female candidate, Petty Officer Chen. The instructors increased the physical demands and psychological pressure, looking for any sign of weakness. During the final week before Hell Week, the instructors conducted individual counseling sessions with each candidate. When Sarah's turn came, she found herself facing a panel of senior SEAL instructors, including several who openly opposed integration. "Martinez," began Master Chief Reynolds, a legendary SEAL with multiple combat deployments. "You've performed better than anyone expected, but Hell Week is different. It's not about being tough for an hour or a day. It's about continuing to function when your body and mind are completely broken down." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I understand, Master Chief." "Do you?" Reynolds leaned forward. "Because when you're carrying a boat on your head for 18 hours straight, when you haven't slept in 4 days, when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to quit, you can't rely on anyone else to carry you. Size and strength matter when it comes to moving heavy objects over long distances." It was a fair point, and Sarah knew it. She was stronger than she'd ever been, but she was still smaller than every male candidate in the class. During the long boat carries and log PT that were central to Hell Week, she'd be at a disadvantage. "Master Chief, I've been the smallest person in every group I've ever been part of," Sarah said. "I've learned to work smarter, not just harder. I've learned to be more valuable to my team in ways that go beyond pure physical strength. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. We'll see, candidate. We'll see. Hell Week began on Sunday evening with Breakout, a chaotic evolution designed to shock candidates into the reality of what they faced. Instructors used sirens, smoke grenades, and aggressive harassment to create an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Sarah's boat crew consisted of 7 men and herself. As the smallest member, she immediately faced the challenge Reynolds had identified. When they had to carry their heavy inflatable boat, she couldn't reach the carrying handles as easily as her taller teammates. But Sarah had prepared for this. Instead of struggling ineffectively, she positioned herself strategically, using her lower center of gravity to help stabilize the boat during movement. When her teammates' strength faltered, her endurance kept them moving. By Monday night, 3 more candidates had quit. The constant physical activity, sleep deprivation, and cold water exposure were taking their toll. Sarah was exhausted but functional, drawing on years of mental conditioning to push through the growing discomfort. Tuesday brought the log PT evolution that many candidates considered the worst part of Hell Week. Teams had to perform synchronized exercises while carrying heavy telephone poles, all while instructors poured cold water on them and screamed corrections. Sarah's boat crew struggled initially. The height differences made synchronization difficult, and Sarah's shorter stature created complications with some movements. But gradually, the team learned to work together, using Sarah's flexibility and timing to improve their overall performance. "Martinez is actually making us better," observed candidate Williams as they rested briefly between evolutions. "She forces us to be more precise with our timing." Wednesday night was traditionally the worst period of Hell Week. By this point, candidates had been awake for over 70 hours. Their bodies were breaking down from constant cold and physical stress, and hallucinations were becoming common. Sarah found herself in a strange mental state, her consciousness floating somewhere above the physical discomfort. She'd discovered years earlier that extreme exhaustion could be transcended through mental discipline, and she used every technique Carlos had taught her about pushing through pain. During a particularly brutal surf passage evolution, where boat crews had to navigate through heavy surf repeatedly, Sarah's boat crew began to struggle. Candidate Morrison, ironically sharing a name with her childhood tormentor, was showing signs of hypothermia and mental confusion. Without hesitation, Sarah took charge. "Morrison, stay in the center of the boat. Williams, help me navigate. We're going to get through this together." Her calm leadership during chaos impressed not just her teammates, but the observing instructors. While other boat crews were falling apart due to exhaustion and poor communication, Sarah's crew remained functional and effective. Thursday brought the around-the-world evolution, a long ocean paddle that tested teams' ability to work together when completely exhausted. Several candidates quit during this exercise, finally broken by the combination of cold, exhaustion, and seemingly endless physical demands. Sarah's hands were raw and bleeding from the paddle. Her body was running on pure willpower, but her mind remained clear and focused. She'd entered a state that athletes call the zone, where physical discomfort becomes secondary to mental determination. Friday morning arrived with the promise of Hell Week's end. The final evolutions tested candidates' ability to function as teams when operating on no sleep and maximum stress. Sarah's boat crew had developed into a highly effective unit, with Sarah serving as an unofficial coordinator who kept them focused and organized. When the final whistle blew, ending Hell Week, 23 candidates remained standing. Sarah was one of them, along with Petty Officer Chen. They had become the first women to successfully complete Hell Week. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Sarah thought about the scared 13-year-old girl who had been called Princess by her tormentors. That girl had dreamed of being strong enough to stand up for herself. This woman had just proven she was strong enough to stand alongside the world's elite warriors. But Hell Week was only the beginning. The remaining phases of Bud S would test different aspects of the candidates' abilities. Land warfare training pushed them through combat skills and small unit tactics. Dive phase tested their ability to function underwater in high-stress scenarios. Sarah excelled in land warfare, her marksmanship skills and tactical thinking earning respect from instructors who had initially doubted her capabilities. During one complex mission scenario, her innovative approach to a seemingly impossible problem impressed even the most skeptical evaluators. Dive phase presented new challenges. Operating underwater with complex equipment while managing stress and emergency situations required a different kind of mental toughness. Sarah's comfort in the water and ability to remain calm under pressure served her well. The final phase of Bud S was graduation. Of the original 48 candidates who had started, only 18 completed the full program. Sarah stood with her classmates as they received their SEAL tridents, becoming the first woman to earn the right to wear the distinctive badge. The ceremony was attended by senior Navy leadership, media representatives, and family members. Sarah's mother was there, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter achieve something that had been considered impossible just years earlier. After the ceremony, Master Chief Reynolds approached Sarah privately. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. I didn't think you could do it. I was wrong." Sarah accepted his handshake with grace. "No apology needed, Master Chief. You pushed me to prove I belonged here. That's exactly what I needed." But earning the trident was only the first step. Sarah still had to complete advanced training, prove herself in a SEAL team, and demonstrate that her success in training would translate to operational effectiveness. Her first assignment was to SEAL Team 8, based in Virginia Beach. The team was commanded by Lieutenant Commander David Parker, a veteran of multiple combat deployments who was initially skeptical about integrating women into his unit. "Martinez," Parker said during her initial interview, "you've accomplished something remarkable by completing Bud S. But training and operations are different animals. My team deploys to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Can you honestly tell me you're ready for combat?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I've been preparing for this my entire adult life. I'm ready to prove myself operationally." Her teammates were a mix of seasoned veterans and recent Bud S graduates. Some welcomed her presence as a historic milestone. Others remained skeptical, waiting to see if her training success would translate to real-world performance. Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, the team's senior enlisted advisor, took a pragmatic approach. "Martinez, I don't care if you're male, female, or Martian. What matters is whether you can do the job when lives are on the line. We'll find out soon enough." Sarah's integration into the team was gradual but steady. She completed advanced training courses in everything from advanced marksmanship to foreign languages. Her smaller size actually proved advantageous in some scenarios. She could fit through spaces that larger operators couldn't navigate, and her lower profile made her less detectable in certain tactical situations. The team deployed to Eastern Europe for training exercises with Allied Special Operations units. Sarah's first real test came during a complex hostage rescue scenario that required precision shooting and split-second decision-making. When the exercise concluded, her teammates' attitudes had shifted noticeably. "Damn, Martinez," said Petty Officer Jackson, a veteran sniper. "That was some impressive shooting under pressure." But the real test was still ahead. The team received orders for a combat deployment to a classified location where they would conduct direct action missions against high-value targets. Sarah was about to find out if all her preparation had been enough to make her an effective warrior in actual combat. As she prepared her gear for deployment, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From a bullied child to a Navy SEAL preparing for combat, it seemed impossible even to her sometimes. But she was no longer the girl they had called Princess. She was Petty Officer Martinez, a qualified Navy SEAL about to deploy in service of her country. Everything she had endured, every challenge she had overcome, had led to this moment. The real test was just beginning. The deployment to Afghanistan changed everything for Sarah. Over 6 months of combat operations, she had proven herself repeatedly in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Her team had conducted 17 successful missions, and Sarah's performance had silenced even the most skeptical critics within SEAL Team 8. Lieutenant Commander Parker's final evaluation was unequivocal. Petty Officer Martinez has demonstrated exceptional capability in combat operations. She is a fully qualified SEAL operator who happens to be female, not a female trying to be a SEAL operator. Recommend for advancement and continued operational assignments. But it was her return to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado that would provide the ultimate test of how far she had come. Sarah was back at Coronado for advanced instructor training, preparing to become one of the cadre who would train future SEAL candidates. It was a prestigious assignment, recognition that she had not only succeeded as an operator, but possessed the skills and knowledge to pass on to the next generation. The incident that would define her legacy began on a Thursday afternoon in the base gym. Sarah was completing her daily workout when she overheard a conversation that took her back to her childhood playground. 6 Marine raiders from the nearby Camp Pendleton were using the Navy facility as part of a joint training exercise. They were impressive physical specimens, all over 6 feet tall, heavily muscled, clearly elite operators in their own right. But their conversation revealed attitudes that were disappointingly familiar. "I still can't believe they let women into the SEALs," said Sergeant First Class Mike Torres, loading weight plates onto a barbell. "It's all political correctness run amok." "Lowered standards is what it is," agreed Staff Sergeant Jake Reynolds. "There's no way a woman can meet the same requirements as a man. They're probably passing them just to check a diversity box." Sarah continued her workout, trying to ignore the conversation. She'd heard it all before, from people who had never witnessed her capabilities firsthand. But the next comment stopped her cold. "I heard one of them is here right now," said Corporal Danny Morrison. "Some little princess who thinks she's as tough as a real SEAL." The word princess hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything she had accomplished, after proving herself in combat, some people still saw her as that weak little girl from middle school. "Where is she?" asked Torres with a mocking laugh. "I'd love to meet this superwoman and see what all the fuss is about." Sarah finished her last set and stood up, her 5'5" frame dwarfed by the 6 Marines, who were each at least 8 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. But as she walked toward them, there was something in her bearing that made other gym users stop and watch. "Excuse me," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had been forged through years of proving doubters wrong. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about female SEALs." Torres turned around, clearly surprised to be confronted. "Yeah? What about it?" "I'm Petty Officer Martinez, and I'm one of those SEALs you're discussing." Sarah's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath the calm exterior. "I thought you might like to meet the princess you were talking about." The 6 Marines exchanged glances, suddenly realizing they'd been overheard by their subject of ridicule. But instead of backing down, Torres doubled down on his position. "Look, no offense, but this is exactly what I'm talking about," Torres said with a condescending smile. "You're what, 5'0" and maybe 140 pounds? How exactly are you supposed to carry a wounded teammate who weighs 200 pounds? How are you supposed to breach a door or take down a terrorist who's twice your size?" Reynolds nodded in agreement. "It's not personal, but physical standards exist for a reason. This isn't about equality, it's about capability." Sarah studied the 6 Marines, recognizing the type immediately. They were good Marines, probably competent operators, but they suffered from the same closed mindset that had plagued her throughout her journey. They couldn't see past their preconceptions to acknowledge what was possible. "You know what?" Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that made several nearby sailors pause their workouts to listen. Instead of talking about theoretical capabilities, why don't we settle this practically? What do you mean? Asked Morrison, though his tone suggested he already knew where this was heading. I mean, let's see who's right. You think I can't meet the standards? Let's test it. Choose any physical challenge you want. If I can't keep up with you, I'll admit you're right. If I can, maybe you'll reconsider your assumptions. The gym had gone quiet. Word was spreading quickly that something significant was happening, and more personnel were gathering to watch. Sarah knew she was taking a risk. If she failed publicly, it would reflect poorly, not just on her, but on all female service members trying to break barriers. But she also knew something the Marines didn't. This wasn't just about physical capability. This was about the difference between someone who had been tested by real adversity and those who had always been told they were naturally superior. Torres looked at his fellow Marines, then back at Sarah. All right, Princess. You want to play with the big boys? Let's start simple. Pull-ups, 25. Can you do that? Sarah almost smiled. Pull-ups had been one of her strongest exercises since her days training with Carlos. 25? That's your challenge? She walked to the pull-up bar and gripped it with perfect form. The gym was completely silent now, with at least 30 people watching. Sarah began her pull-ups with smooth, controlled movements that demonstrated not just strength, but technical perfection. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. She didn't stop. 30, 35, 40. At 50 perfect pull-ups, she finally dropped down, not even breathing heavily. The silence was deafening. Torres's confident expression had been replaced by shocked recognition. These weren't the pull-ups of someone who had been given easier standards. These were the numbers of an elite athlete. Not bad, Torres admitted grudgingly. But pull-ups don't tell the whole story. Let's see how you do with something more practical. He gestured toward the obstacle course visible through the gym windows. How about we run the O course? Full tactical gear, winner takes bragging rights. Sarah nodded. All 6 of you, or just one? Reynolds stepped forward. I'll take that challenge. Former college wrestler, been a Marine for 8 years. This should be interesting. 20 minutes later, Sarah and Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood at the starting line of the obstacle course, both wearing full tactical gear, including helmet, body armor, and equipment, weighing approximately 50 pounds. A crowd had gathered, including several SEAL instructors who had heard about the challenge. Senior Chief Thompson, Sarah's former screening instructor, approached them before the start. Martinez, you sure about this? You don't have anything to prove to these guys. Sarah looked at the crowd, at the Marines who were still convinced this was going to be a demonstration of female inadequacy, at the mixed expressions of support and concern from her fellow SEALs. Actually, Senior Chief, I think I do have something to prove. Not to them, but for everyone who comes after me. The course began with a series of walls to climb, obstacles that favored upper body strength and height. Reynolds took an early lead, his longer reach and greater mass allowing him to power through the initial challenges. But as the course progressed, subtle differences began to emerge. While Reynolds was strong, Sarah was efficient. Where he used brute force, she used technique. Where he fought against obstacles, she flowed through them. The rope climb was the turning point. Reynolds attacked it with pure arm strength, climbing quickly but inefficiently. Sarah used a technique that engaged her entire body, moving up the rope with fluid, economical motions that conserved energy while maintaining speed. By the halfway point, they were even. The crowd was murmuring in amazement. This wasn't supposed to be competitive. Reynolds was beginning to breathe heavily, the weight of his gear and his aggressive approach taking their toll. The final section of the course included a series of low crawls under obstacles, an evolution that favored Sarah's smaller profile and flexibility. She moved through these obstacles like water, while Reynolds struggled with his larger frame. Emerging from the final low crawl, Sarah had taken a slight lead. The last obstacle was a wall climb, followed by a sprint to the finish. Both warriors were exhausted, but Sarah had managed her energy more effectively throughout the course. As they approached the wall, Reynolds made one final surge, his competitive instincts driving him to close the gap. They reached the wall simultaneously, beginning their climbs side by side. At the top, they were dead even, but the descent and final sprint would determine the winner. Sarah went over the wall with gymnastic precision, landing in a controlled roll that preserved her momentum. Reynolds went over powerfully but landed hard, losing precious seconds recovering his balance. Sarah crossed the finish line 3 seconds ahead of Reynolds, collapsing to her knees not from exhaustion but from emotional release. She had just beaten an elite Marine raider in head-to-head competition while wearing the same gear and facing the same challenges. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even the Marines who had been skeptical were clapping, though more in shock than celebration. Reynolds approached Sarah as she caught her breath, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Outstanding run," he said simply. "I was wrong about you." But Torres wasn't ready to concede. "All right, so you can run an obstacle course. But what about hand-to-hand combat? That's where size and strength really matter." The suggestion sent a ripple of concern through the crowd. Combat sports between men and women of such different sizes carried real risks, and Sarah had already proven her point decisively. But Sarah stood up, her breathing now controlled, her expression calm but determined. "What did you have in mind?" "Grappling match," Torres said. "Submission wrestling. No strikes, just grappling until one person submits or is clearly defeated." Senior Chief Thompson stepped forward. "Martinez, this isn't necessary. You've already demonstrated your capabilities." Sarah looked at the 6 Marines, then at the crowd of sailors and SEALs watching. Some were concerned for her safety, others were excited to see how this would play out. But what she saw most clearly were the same dynamics that had shaped her entire life, people underestimating her based on their preconceptions. "I'll do it," she said, "but not just against Torres, against all 6 of them." The crowd fell silent. Even Torres looked stunned. "What?" "You heard me. All 6 of you, one after another. No rest between matches. If I can't handle Marines one-on-one, I certainly can't handle them in real combat where there might be multiple threats." Morrison stepped forward. "That's crazy. Even if you beat 1 or 2 of us, fatigue will get you eventually." Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Maybe. But that's exactly the kind of challenge that'll prove the point once and for all. Either I'm as capable as I claim to be, or I'm not." The matches were held on the wrestling mats in the base martial arts facility. Word had spread throughout the base, and the audience now included officers and senior enlisted personnel from multiple units. This had evolved from a simple gym confrontation into something that would be remembered and discussed for years. Master Chief Peterson, the base martial arts coordinator, served as referee. "This is submission grappling," he announced. "Match ends when one participant submits or is unable to continue. Medical personnel are standing by." Sarah's first opponent was Corporal Morrison, the youngest of the Marines at 23 years old. He outweighed her by 60 pounds and had wrestled in college. As they faced off, the size difference was striking. Morrison looked like he could simply overpower her through brute force. But Sarah had been studying martial arts since her early teens, and her SEAL training had included extensive hand-to-hand combat instruction. More importantly, she had learned to use an opponent's size and strength against them. Morrison came at her aggressively, trying to use his weight advantage to pin her quickly. But Sarah was like Mercury. She flowed away from his attacks, using his momentum to off-balance him. When he overcommitted to a takedown attempt, she countered with a textbook hip toss that sent him crashing to the mat. From there, Sarah demonstrated the technical superiority that came from years of dedicated training. While Morrison tried to muscle out of holds, Sarah was setting up the next move. Her smaller size actually worked to her advantage. She could transition between positions more quickly and with less energy expenditure. 7 minutes into the match, Sarah secured a rear naked choke that left Morrison no choice but to tap out. As they broke apart, Morrison looked stunned. "How the hell did you do that?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier skepticism. "Technique beats strength when technique is sharp enough," Sarah replied, already preparing for the next opponent. Her second match was against Lance Corporal Davis, who had watched Morrison's defeat with growing concern. Davis was more cautious, trying to use his reach advantage to control distance and avoid Sarah's grappling attempts. But Sarah had learned patience through years of dealing with people who underestimated her. She worked methodically, feinting attacks to draw Davis into committing to defensive positions that left him vulnerable to counters. When Davis finally committed to an aggressive attack, Sarah was ready. She used his momentum to execute a beautiful judo throw, following up immediately with a ground position that allowed her to control the larger man despite his strength advantage. This match lasted 12 minutes, with Davis showing impressive defensive skills that forced Sarah to work harder for her victory. But when she finally secured a shoulder lock that threatened serious injury, Davis wisely submitted. The third opponent, Sergeant Williams, had clearly been studying Sarah's technique during the first 2 matches. He approached the contest more strategically, trying to neutralize her technical advantages through careful positioning and defensive grappling. Williams proved to be the most challenging opponent yet. His conservative approach forced Sarah to take more risks, and his wrestling background gave him the skills to partially counter her techniques. For several minutes, it appeared the match might end in a stalemate, but fatigue was becoming a factor for both fighters. And Williams's larger size meant he was burning energy faster than Sarah. As the match entered its 15th minute, Williams began to slow noticeably. Sarah sensed the shift and increased her pace, forcing Williams to work harder defensively. When he finally made a mistake in positioning, Sarah capitalized with a submission hold that ended the match. 3 down, 3 to go. Sarah was beginning to feel the accumulated fatigue of nearly 40 minutes of high-intensity grappling, but she had proven that technique and conditioning could overcome significant size disadvantages. Her fourth opponent was Staff Sergeant Reynolds, the Marine who had lost the obstacle course competition. Reynolds had been analyzing Sarah's approach throughout the previous matches and had developed a strategy specifically designed to counter her techniques. Reynolds proved to be Sarah's most difficult challenge yet. His combination of wrestling skill, tactical thinking, and determination pushed Sarah to her limits. The match evolved into a chess game of position and counterposition, with both fighters demonstrating exceptional technique and mental toughness. 22 minutes into the match, both fighters were exhausted and covered in sweat. Reynolds had successfully defended against several of Sarah's submission attempts and had nearly achieved a victory of his own when he briefly secured a dominant position. But Sarah's years of mental conditioning proved decisive. When most people would have been overwhelmed by fatigue and frustration, she found another level of focus. Drawing on everything Carlos had taught her about pushing through when every fiber of your being wanted to quit. Sarah mounted one final offensive. The ending came suddenly. Reynolds, pushing through his own exhaustion, made a small error in foot positioning. Sarah immediately capitalized, flowing into a leg lock that left Reynolds no choice but to submit. As they separated, Reynolds shook his head in amazement. "Unbelievable. You just beat 4 Marines in a row, and you're still ready for more?" Sarah was indeed tired, more tired than she had been since Hell Week, but she was also operating in that transcendent zone where physical limitations become secondary to mental determination. "Two more," she said simply. The fifth Marine was Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah, a former amateur boxer who had been hoping to use his striking background in a grappling match. But without the ability to use punches and kicks, his boxing skills were less relevant than his natural athleticism and competitive drive. Martinez proved to be surprisingly difficult, not because of superior technique, but because of his exceptional physical conditioning and refusal to submit. Sarah found herself working harder for each positional advancement, and Martinez's defensive tenacity forced her to be more creative in her attack sequences. This match lasted 28 minutes, making it the longest and most grueling of the evening. When Sarah finally achieved the submission, both fighters were completely exhausted. Martinez had pushed her to the absolute limits of her endurance and mental toughness. "Respect!" Martinez gasped as they separated. "I've never seen anything like this." Which left Torres, the Marine who had started the entire confrontation with his dismissive comments about female SEALs. Torres was the largest of the 6 Marines, the most experienced and clearly the most motivated to prove that Sarah's success had been a fluke. As they faced off for the final match, the crowd was completely silent. Sarah had already accomplished something unprecedented by defeating 5 elite Marines in succession, but Torres represented the final test, the ultimate validation of her capabilities. The match began with Torres attempting to use his size advantage to overwhelm Sarah immediately. He was clearly hoping to end things quickly before accumulated fatigue could compromise his strength advantage. But Sarah was operating in a zone beyond normal physical limitations. Every technique was executed with precision, born from years of perfect practice. Every transition was economical and purposeful. She had transcended the normal boundaries between mind and body. Torres found himself fighting not just Sarah, but everything she represented, every person who had been underestimated because of their size, gender, or background. She moved with the accumulated force of every challenge she had overcome, every barrier she had broken, every moment of doubt she had transformed into determination. The ending was both inevitable and shocking. After 31 minutes of the most intense grappling anyone in the crowd had ever witnessed, Torres made a crucial error. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps it was frustration, but he committed too aggressively to an attack that left him vulnerable. Sarah's final submission was a work of art, a complex sequence that demonstrated not just technical mastery, but the kind of tactical thinking that made her an effective combat operator. Torres had no choice but to submit. As they separated for the final time, Torres looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. The cocky Marine who had dismissed female SEALs as diversity hires was gone, replaced by a warrior who recognized another warrior. "I owe you an apology," Torres said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "And not just for what I said earlier, for every assumption I made about what you could or couldn't do." Sarah looked at the 6 Marines, all of whom were now looking at her with respect rather than skepticism, then at the crowd of sailors and SEALs who had witnessed something extraordinary. "No apology needed," she said. "You did exactly what I needed you to do. You gave me a chance to prove not just what I can do, but what anyone can do if they're willing to put in the work." Senior Chief Thompson approached as the crowd began to disperse. "Martinez, that was one of the most impressive displays of warrior spirit I've ever seen. But why did you feel you had to prove yourself like that?" Sarah thought about the question as she toweled off sweat and prepared to leave. Why had she felt compelled to take on 6 Marines in succession? She could have walked away after the first victory, or chosen not to engage at all. "Senior Chief," she said finally, "every woman who comes after me in special operations is going to face the same skepticism, the same assumptions, the same challenges. I wanted to make their path a little easier by proving that those assumptions are wrong." Thompson nodded slowly. Mission accomplished, Martinez. Mission definitely accomplished. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the scared little girl being called princess by schoolyard bullies to the Navy SEAL who had just defeated 6 Marines in combat, the transformation seemed almost impossible. But it hadn't been impossible. It had been inevitable. Every challenge had prepared her for the next one. Every person who had doubted her had motivated her to become stronger. Every barrier had become a stepping stone. The next morning, Sarah received a message that her story had spread throughout the military community. The video of her defeating the 6 Marines had been shared widely, becoming a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity. But perhaps the most meaningful response came in an email from her old middle school guidance counselor who had somehow heard about her achievements. Sarah, I remember a scared little girl who used to get picked on and called names. I wish I could have told that girl that she would grow up to become one of America's most elite warriors. You've inspired more people than you'll ever know. Sarah smiled as she read the message, thinking about that terrified 13-year-old who had been humiliated in the gymnasium. If she could go back and tell that girl one thing, it would be simple. They're wrong about you. All of them. You're not weak, you're not helpless, and you're definitely not just a princess. You're going to become something extraordinary. And 25 years later, Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, the first woman to earn a Navy SEAL trident and the warrior who had defeated 6 Marines in a single evening, knew that the scared little girl had always carried the seeds of the warrior she would become. She just had to be strong enough to nurture them through all the storms that tried to wash them away. The princess had become a gladiator, and she was just getting started.